Very often, the first reaction when people see elite bodybuilders or champion bodybuilders, their first reaction is to say, hey, it's all steroids. These guys and these women, they're all steroids. The implication, of course, being that without taking anabolic drugs like steroids and growth hormone, these elite bodybuilders, for example, Mr. Olympia, national bodybuilding champion, Mr. Universe, whatever, would all look like average people. Uh, I kind of, anyone who's involved in bodybuilding gets a good laugh out of that, because anyone who's worked out for any amount of time knows that it takes a lot more than just drugs to produce a championship bodybuilding physique, especially on the level of, let's say, a Mr. Olympia or a professional bodybuilder. I've seen in the over 5 decades I've been involved in bodybuilding, I've seen countless and thousands of people use steroids. And I'm not going to say they all look like crap. A lot of them looked very good. A lot of them were Mr. Olympias. I mean, a lot of them were successful. However, I've seen people, for example, just to, right off the top of my head, I was around Gold's Gym, and in the heyday of Gold's Gym, when Arnold was training there in the 70s, I personally witnessed I'd say about 15 different bodybuilders who trained with Arnold. And Arnold was generous in telling him exactly what he took. He never tried to hide anything as far as his steroid program. And he actually told him exactly what drugs he took. In some cases, he even gave him the drugs. I was there when he actually gave a couple of top bodybuilders steroid shots. But however, the point being that all these guys duplicated to a T Arnold's steroid program, and yet none of them, not a single one of them, ever came close to looking like Arnold. Some looked better than others, but they did not look like Arnold. So what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say here that the attainment of a tremendous, let's say, elite physique takes a lot more than just anabolic drugs. It takes, of course, training. It takes good nutrition. But one of the main underlying features determining how successful you'll be as a bodybuilder is just the general term good genetics. And you hear this thrown out a lot. They talk about Phil Heath, for example. Oh, the guy, they call him the gift because he seemed to be born to be a championship bodybuilder. Then there's a story of Ronnie Coleman, 8-time Mr. Olympia. The very first time he walked into a gym in Texas, the owner of the gym asked him how many contests he'd competed in, and Coleman had no idea what he was talking about. He had never even seen a bodybuilding contest, and yet to the owner of the gym, Coleman looked already like a competitive bodybuilder, and he hadn't even been lifting weights. This is an example of extreme good genetics. Another example of extreme good genetics is my good friend Flex Wheeler. Flex is an unusual case. I'll discuss two features of what he kind of like what's unique for Flex. For one thing, is that he started out as what they call an ectomorph. He's a naturally very thin guy. He has very small joints, very small hips, and he basically blew up his muscles around those small joints, and it gave him the physique that he showed, this tremendous physique that he showed later on. Uh, so there's some rumors that Flex also lacks a gene for a protein called myostatin. Myostatin inhibits muscle growth, and I'll discuss that in a minute, but let's talk about generally what are the factors that determine good genetics in bodybuilding. Well, the most obvious ones are probably having naturally wide shoulders and a naturally narrow waist and narrow hips. Unfortunately, these particular factors are strictly genetic, and there's not much you can do about it. If you're born with narrow shoulders, there's not much you can do about it. However, I trained under a fantastic, one of the greatest bodybuilding trainers ever. There was a guy, his name was Vince Garanda in the 60s, and Garanda believed that even a guy with narrow shoulders can present the illusion of having wider shoulders by kind of specializing on the lateral or side head of the deltoid. And he had a number of movements. He had a special way of doing dumbbell side laterals, pulley laterals, and also a shoulder width upright row where he brought it up to the lower pectorals. It would kind of simulate a lateral raise. All of these things would pack muscle on the lateral head of the deltoid, and according to Vince, it would create the illusion of you having wider shoulders. Now, if you have a wide waist, of course, there's not much you can do about it. But if you develop your upper body to a superior extent, a lot of thickness in the chest area, and also, getting really big shoulders, like Vince's technique of kind of bulking up your lateral deltoid hip. You could probably take the emphasis off the wide waist, or you could do what a lot of men did, like Larry Scott, who I'll mention also in a minute. If you have a wide waist, don't emphasize it in a bodybuilding contest. Do mostly side poses where you could suck in your waist. So that's one way around that. Uh, Another thing that really, I believe, you don't hear about this a lot, but I personally believe a lot of bodybuilding successes depends on your fat cells. In other words, having fewer fat cells and smaller fat cells means you tend to have lower body fat levels, so you get more cut. It's a lot easier to acquire a greater degree of muscular definition. You can control body fat to a large extent with exercise and diet, but if you're born with naturally small fat cells, and fat cells that are not numerous, you have a huge head start in terms of muscular definition. These are the guys that get really, really ripped. I mean, guys with enlarged fat cells, what they call hypertrophic hyperplastic obesity, meaning large fat cells and numerous fat cells, they have an uphill battle because those fat cells are very stubborn. It's really hard to get down to the point where you get that's kind of see-through skin, where it shows all the vascularity. It's real tough for those kind of guys. So fat cells are another obvious factor in bodybuilding good genetics is the state of your hormones, particularly the anabolic hormones, testosterone and growth hormone. Having a naturally higher testosterone level, of course, equals a much greater tendency to produce larger muscles because testosterone, of course, is an anabolic hormone. The same with growth hormone. Having higher levels will definitely give you a huge head start. I wrote about a study years ago where they got a couple of young guys about maybe 18 years old to begin a weight training, and they took a baseline check of their anabolic hormones, testosterone, growth hormone. Then they put them on a weight training program, and the guys that had the highest levels of testosterone and growth hormone made about twice as many gains as the other guys that had, let's say, normal levels of or lower levels of testosterone and growth hormone. So, of course, the way around that is obvious. You could take anabolic steroid drugs and all that stuff, and that's what most people actually wind up doing. But, again, having the hormones naturally high is a big advantage, especially when you first begin training. From an anatomical point of view, having long muscle bellies and short insertions. For example, when you flex your bicep, having the bicep go all the way from the shoulder basically to the elbow with no great gap, that indicates a longer muscle belly. Or for example, longer calves versus high calves, again, indicates more muscle fibers, and more muscle fibers indicate a greater potential of growth. So if you have short muscle bellies, it means that you have fewer muscle fibers. It's going to be more difficult for you to build muscle. There is a theory that if you're young enough and you train hard enough, you can actually develop new fibers. It's called hyperplasia. This has not been definitively proven in humans. But there was a study once where they compared bodybuilders to pencil neck college students who never touched a weight, and they thought the bodybuilders would have a lot larger muscle fibers because they were obviously had much greater muscle size than the students. But when they actually looked at the fibers, the bodybuilders had the same size fibers as the college students, but the bodybuilders had much more muscle fibers, and that accounted for their growth. And the theory was that through years of training, the bodybuilders had undergone this hyperplasic effect where they developed new muscle fibers, which allowed them to exceed their, let's say, initial genetic potential. Again, this is a theory. There's no solid evidence for this yet. But I just wanted to throw that in. Another thing that could play a genetic factor in muscle growth is neuromuscular efficiency. When you first start training, the initial gains you make are a result of neuromuscular efficiency, which is broadly defined as a better connection between your brain and the muscles. In other words, you get a better coordination between brain and muscles so the muscles can contract harder and stronger, through mechanisms in the brain that interact with the muscles themselves through the nervous system. Having that naturally means that you're going to start off stronger than normal, and you're going to be able to lift heavier. So, of course, you're going to make greater gains. So, neuromuscular efficiency is another factor. Again, from an anatomical point of view, you have what they call satellite cells. Satellite cells are muscle stem cells that are involved in the muscle hypertrophy and repair process. Every time you damage a muscle, satellite cells are activated and they contribute myonuclei to help repair muscles. But having a more efficient or more numerous amount of satellite cells indicates a much greater potential for muscular growth. As people get older, they tend to lose satellite cells, and this is partially responsible for the loss of muscle mass with the passing years. As you get older, your muscles tend to get smaller. A lot of this is due to a lack of response of these same satellite cells. I've done a lot of research on satellite cells. I have an article that's going to be coming up in my Applied Metabolic newsletter where I've actually found some ways that are not generally known where you could basically reactivate dormant satellite cells and again experience new muscle growth. This has not been discussed anywhere else that I know about except in extremely technical science journals, but there will be an article about this in my Applied Metabolics newsletter exclusively. I'm not going to write about it anywhere else. Then you have the other intramuscular hormonal factors. For example, intramuscular IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. This hormone works to activate satellite cells. So you can see the importance of having high amounts of intramuscular IGF-1. Systemic IGF-1, which is produced in the liver, has much less of an effect on muscle growth. It's the intramuscular form that really makes a difference. Another anabolic hormone found in muscle is a variant of IGF-1. It's called mechanic growth factor. For some reason, the mechanic growth factor found naturally in muscle is a very potent anabolic stimulus to satellite cell activation. But recent studies show when you give exogenous mechanic growth factor, like in a shot, it doesn't seem to do much at all. It's a strange phenomenon which I just can't explain at this point. But let me put it this way. You might see mechanic growth factor advertised on various internet sites. I've looked at 2 or 3 studies that show that these particular injections do almost nothing to stimulate muscle growth. They're a waste of money. However, the natural mechanic growth factor produced in your muscle is without question anabolic. So another thing that affects another strong genetic factor for muscle growth is your natural body structure. This is called somatic types. There are 3 basic kinds. Mesomorph tends to be kind of naturally muscular, broader shoulders, smaller hips, smaller waist, and it looks fairly athletic. So obviously this is kind of like a born bodybuilder type. I think Phil Heath might be a more of a mesomorph. Most bodybuilders, however, strangely enough, most champion bodybuilders, I've always asked this question. I've interviewed thousands of them over the years. From my experience, most champion bodybuilders start out as what they call ectomorphs. They tend to be thin and they wind up packing muscle on. Being thin, again, that relates to what I said earlier about having fewer fat cells and smaller fat cells. So anything weight they pack on tends to be muscle. So again, the ectomorph is thin. The mesomorph tends to be already athletic-looking muscle. And then you have the endomorph, which is the person with more fat cells, a little bit heavier, wider hips, wider waist. An endomorph can be a champion bodybuilder, but it takes a lot more strict dieting. You have to do more endurance work. You have to constantly control body fat. The advantages that endomorphs do tend to have larger bone structures, which allows them to pack on more muscle a little bit easier. But again, it's an uphill battle for them as far as muscle definition goes. To be honest with you, you very, very rarely see pure examples of these 3 types of body types. In other words, it's usually a mixture. Most champion bodybuilders tend to be ectomesomorphs, meaning they start off thin and then they put on some muscle, but they still, if they didn't work out, they revert back to being thin, and that would be an ectomesomorph. And there are also endomesomorphs, where basically these are the guys that look tremendous when they're competing and all that. When they lay off, if they don't do any exercise and they continue to eat, they tend to get fat. Those are your endomesomorphs. So those are the types. So, and I mentioned earlier the lack of being born with a lack of myostatin. Myostatin is a protein in muscle that inhibits muscle growth. I've read something about where Flex Wheeler supposedly has been tested and he lacks one gene from myostatin. lacking myostatin would do, or even if you lacked one gene, it would mean you're very responsive to weight training. When you start weight training, you're going to make very fast gains because basically the lock on muscle growth is decreased. So your muscles will respond very fast. My personal opinion is that myostatin null people, as it's called, meaning when they're lacking one or two genes from myostatin, I think it's extremely rare. I don't think there's been many bodybuilders that have actually born with this particular condition. I think a lot of them think they have it. I don't think they really do. Because for one thing, if you lack myostatin, you're also going to have severe tendon problems. You're going to constantly get injuries, and it can also have a bad effect on your heart. And as far as I know, I haven't heard too much about this. So I tend to think this notion that a lot of these champion bodybuilders lack myostatin, I personally believe it's overplayed. I don't think it's true. They have great genetics in these other aspects I mentioned, but not necessarily a lack of myostatin. Again, examples of great genetics in bodybuilders. Ronnie Coleman, as I mentioned, he looked like a bodybuilder before he even touched a weight. Flex Wheeler, who started out very thin, and he became one of the most complete bodybuilders of all time. Tremendous physique. He had everything a great bodybuilder had to have to win. This guy had. It's unfortunate that Flex had to go up against Ronnie Coleman. If it was anyone else, Flex would have been a multiple Mr. Olympia winner, in my opinion. Sean Ray, a shorter man, great genetics. Lee Labrada, past bodybuilder. Who's that guy from Australia? Lee, I can't remember his last name offhand. Lee Priest. Lee Priest, again, very responsive. Lee, believe it or not, is a good example of an endomesomorph, because I've seen Lee between contests. He likes to eat and he gets as fat as a butterball, and yet he always gets in tremendous muscular shape. So those of you with, let's say, who tend to gain weight, don't be discouraged. Look at a guy like Lee Priest. He just, through sheer training and diet, the guy gets in tremendous absolute shape with almost no body fat at all. And I also want to mention that those of you who might not be blessed with good genetics, you shouldn't let that discourage you. And I'll give you a good example of that. There was a guy years ago named Larry Scott. Larry Scott won the first two Mr. Olympia contests in 1965 and 1966. And Larry Scott was a classic example of bad genetics. He had narrow shoulders, a wide waist. He had no thickness in his back, a narrow back, mediocre leg, pretty good calves, but nothing in the thighs, no leg bicep at all. And yet he won the Olympia twice. How did he do it? He maximized what he was blessed with. To make it a long story shorter, Larry Scott had tremendous deltoid bicep tricep development. He emphasized that when he posed. He did all twisting poses to kind of like, disguise his lack of shoulder width and back thickness, and to disguise his wider waist. And he knew how to pose to show his great features of shoulders and arms. His shoulders and arms were the best of his era. Nobody could match them. That's what he did. I mean, you can look at photos. Scott's shoulders and arms were so great that they wouldn't be even out of place in today's competition. 50 years later, there's few guys that could match the shoulder and arm development of Larry Scott. Another great bodybuilder I should mention, I'd be bereft if I didn't mention this guy. Sergio Oliva they used to call him the Myth. Another tremendous, this guy started as an Olympic weightlifter in Cuba. And even as an Olympic weightlifter, he looked like a champion bodybuilder. He had a tiny waist, wide shoulders, tremendous calves. This guy had all the attributes of great genetics. He never dieted. He didn't really know how to train, but he still won the Mr. Olympia 3 times. If you want to see an example of how great genetics are passed on, one of my good friends is his son, Sergio Oliva Jr., and I marvel when I see Sergio, because I often remark about this to him, how similar in muscle shape he is. His muscles are shaped very similarly to Sergio Oliva, who I did see in person many, many times when he was at his peak, Sergio Oliva Sr. And Sergio Jr. has inherited nearly all of his muscles look exactly like Sergio Sr. And that's a good example of good genetics being inherited. So again, this, just to sum it all up, there's not much you could do. I mean, if you're born with, let's say, the bad features, narrow shoulders, wide waist, muscles that aren't very responsive, it'll be a little bit more of an uphill battle. But the good thing about weight training is if you do everything right, if you diet right, you train hard, anybody, I don't care how bad your genetics, can get remarkable results, and you don't have to take drugs to do it. Now, if you want more information about nutrition, exercise science, hormonal therapy, anti-aging, fat loss techniques, ergogenic aids, everything in depth. Like I say, I'm going to have an article on satellite cells, how to activate them. This would be very good for a hard gainer. I also have articles in my Applied Metabolics newsletter all the time about ways to overcome some of the, let's say, the barriers that hard gainers face. It's 40 to 50 pages every month. It's more like a monthly ebook. I guarantee you, if you read my newsletter, you will be an expert. You will know everything there is to know about every topic I write about, because all my articles are very in-depth, and there's nothing that can match it on the internet, in magazines, nowhere, because nobody has my combination of years of study and 54 years of practical experience. It's absolutely unmatched, and I'm putting all of this knowledge I've learned over the years into Applied Metabolics. www.appliedmetabolics.com. And by the way, do yourself a favor, go to the nearest shelter, adopt a dog. They're the best friends you'll ever have. Thank you for listening.